Uh, Hello everyone, I'm Arindam Ghosh. As you all know, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English, Krishna Chandra College, Hetampur, Birbhum, and this is my actually 8th lecture on post-colonialism. So I was teaching you about post-colonialism. I have talked about the definition and scope of post-colonialism. I have also talked about what colonialism is and what are the major discourses involving colonialism. I told you about various types of colonialism: settler colonialism, exploitation colonialism, surrogate colonialism, etc. in the previous lectures. Then I also talked about some of the characteristics of post-colonialism and post-colonial literature. And then in the previous video lectures, I've talked about some of the chief and key theoreticians of post-colonialism, and among them in a separate video I talked about Frantz Fanon and psychopathology of colonialism, the impact of colonialism on the psychology of the natives and on the indigenous people. And in the previous video I have discussed about Edward Said, his own notions of Orientalism, and how Orientalism actually creates a very important way of a very important discursive component, adds a very important discursive component to this post-colonial studies. In this present lecture, I will talk about Homi K Bhabha and his theories of mimicry, hybridity, difference, ambivalence, and others. Homi K Bhabha, born in 1949, is an Indian English scholar born in Mumbai, now Bombay. He was graduated in English honors from Elphinstone College, and then he studied in the Christ Church College of Oxford, and currently he is now an Annie F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities at the Harvard University. One of the most important figures of the contemporary post-colonial studies, he has developed a number of neologisms. What is neologism? Neologism is a newly coined term created by a thinker. So he is responsible for the field's neologisms, some of the most important neologisms like hybridity, mimicry, difference, and ambivalence. What are they? I will discuss later on. But these terms actually describe the ways in which colonized people have resisted the power of the colonizer. This is a story of the resistance. This is a story of rebellion of the colonizer against the colonized. These terms actually explained the story of various pockets of resistance, various micro narratives resisting the grand narrative of colonialism. So he received Padma Bhushan in 2012 in the field of the literature and education from the Indian government. One of the most key thinkers of post-colonialism. Let us have a look into his work. Wait a minute, there is some technical problem, I guess. Yes. Yes. So, mimicry, ambivalence, and hybridity. Let us discuss about these terms. What are they? So, according to Homi Bhabha, perhaps the most important thing to discuss about colonizer and the colonized relationship is about the subjectivity of the native. The subjectivity, the subjective thinking, the mind of the indigenous people is very important to Bhabha. And in the post-colonial analysis regarding the mind of the native, he actually have taken recourse to the theory of interpellation as propounded by Althusser, a famous Marxist theorist. His work, Bhabha's work, actually reveals how the colonial discourse that sought to impose a unidirectional flow of power. Unidirectional means one directional flow of power from the colonizer to the colonized. This is actually the aim and the objective, the primary aim and the objective of the colonial discourse, to impose a unidirectional power from the colonizer to the colonized, and to propose a monolithic structure of power, often fail. So Bhabha's work is about the failure of the flow of the power, failure of the flow of the unidirectional power on the part of the colonizer. এই ব্যর্থতা থেকেই, এই কলোনাইজারের এই ধরনের ব্যর্থতা থেকেই মিমিক্রি, অ্যাম্বিভ্যালেন্স, হাইব্রিডিটি এই ধরনের টার্মগুলো ক্রিয়েটেড হচ্ছে থ্রু বিকজ অফ দ্য ভেরিয়াস গ্যাপস অ্যান্ড দ্য স্লিপেজেস in the colonial discourse. So Bhabha's work on the mimicry, ambivalence and hybridity radically interrogates the effectiveness of the colonial discourse. It questions the colonial discourse. The colonial discourse কতটা sacrosanct, কতটা autotelic, কতটা robust system, তাই নিয়ে কিন্তু Bhabha প্রশ্ন তুলছেন while pointing out to its fractures, to the fractures of the discourse. এই ডিসকোর্সের মধ্যে কি সমস্ত ফাটলগুলো আছেন, কলোনিয়ালিজম যে একটা অল পারভেডিং অ্যান্ড অল পাওয়ারফুল সিস্টেম নয়, তার কথা Bhabha তার ওয়ার্কের মধ্যে দিয়ে দেখাচ্ছেন. অ্যান্ড হি ইজ সেইং ফর দ্য ফার্স্ট টাইম দ্যাট the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is not a monolithic structure, but the relationship is essentially transactional in nature. যেরকম ভাবে colonized colonizerকে colonizedকে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স করছে, মানে যেরকমভাবে একজন ব্রিটিশ ইন্ডিয়ানকে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স করছে, সেরকমভাবে একজন ইন্ডিয়ানও একটা ব্রিটিশ সাহেবকে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স করছে, যেখানে কলোনাইজডও কলোনাইজারকে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স করার চেষ্টা করছে. So Bhabha begins his reading of this colonialism by noting how identities in the colonial encounter are never stable or fixed. How this identity of the native or of the colonial master is never stable and fixed. কোনোদিন একটা জায়গায় ধীর স্থির অবস্থায় এই আইডেন্টিটি থাকবে না. It is constantly volatile and ever fluctuating. So colonial encounters are basically transactions between the colonizer and the colonized. The European in the colony constructs his identity only through a relationality based on difference. Only through his, by building out, Bhabha actually started by saying, by proposing the concept that that identities, even in the colonial context, are based on this differential relations, on this on the basis of the relationality, building on the Lacanian concept of the psychoanalysis and post-structuralism. He have propounded his own theory. কিভাবে এই ধরনের colonial and post-colonial identity formed হয় on the part of the colonizer and the colonized, সে কথা বলতে গিয়ে উনি বলেন যে প্রভাবটা কখনোই কলোনাইজারের কলোনাইজডের উপরে একমুখী নয়. অর্থাৎ এসেনশিয়ালি অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই কলোনাইজডও কলোনাইজারের উপরে অনেক ধরনের ইনফ্লুয়েন্স তৈরি করে. অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই মেনি ইউরোপিয়ান সাহেবস অ্যান্ড মেনি ব্রিটিশার্স have compelled to learn English, compelled to learn Hindi language and at least some of the native Indian languages, Bengali and others, in their administrative tenure in India. So তারাও এই ভাষাটাকে ভালোবাসুক বা না বাসুক শিখতে অনেক ক্ষেত্রে বাধ্য হয়েছেন. I have already mentioned to an allusion of Feluda in one of my previous lectures, যেখানে সমাদদারের চাবি গল্পে ফেলুদা বলছেন যে অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই অনেক ব্রিটিশ সাহেবরা অনেক দেশীয় টার্মিনোলজি মনে রাখতে অনেক ধরনের ইংলিশ এপিথেট বা ইংলিশ প্রভাব বা শব্দবন্ধ তৈরি করতেন. ফর এক্সাম্পল, দেয়ার ওয়াজ আ ব্রাউন ক্রো, দেয়ার ওয়াজ আ ব্রাউন ক্রো, দরওয়াজা বন্ধ করো. দরওয়াজা বন্ধ করোকে মনে করার জন্য দেয়ার ওয়াজ আ ব্রাউন ক্রোটা মাথায় রাখতো. সো এইভাবে একজন নেটিভও, একজন কলোনাইজড পার্সোনালিটিও অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই কলোনাইজারকে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স করতে পারত। And hence Bhabha says that the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is not a monolithic one. It's not a unidirectional flow of the power, but rather is essentially an ambivalent structure, is essentially transactional in nature. এত সহজে কলোনাইজার এবং কলোনাইজডের যে সম্পর্ক সেটাকে একমুখী, ক্ষমতার একমুখী ফ্লো, একদিকে ক্ষমতা বয়ে যাচ্ছে কলোনাইজার থেকে কলোনাইজড, সেটা কিন্তু বলা যাবে না। And hence Bhabha said that identities therefore is constantly shifting. There is no such monolithic and one-dimensional terms like quote-unquote Bengali identity or quote-unquote Punjabi identity. Rather, it can refer to Punjabi identities, the multivalence, the plural nature of the identity. So identity is therefore constantly shifting, they are liminal and they are displaced. And with this particular move, Bhabha actually proposed that colonial discourse is actually conflictual and ambivalent in nature. Because the colonial master, far from being the strong, unflinching Southern Englishman, is actually informed by the two contradictory psychic states. And they are fetish and phobia. Now what are they? These two contradictory states result in stereotypes of the native subject. One is fetish and another is phobia. Through this, a native subject or an indigenous subject is being constructed differently in the mind of the colonizer. And Bhabha argues that the fetish and the phobia structure of the colonial relations results in a condition where the white man seeks and desires the other. Through the deep psychological conflicted kotha Bhabha bolte chaichen. Fetish means a form of obsession, a great desire for a particular thing, something particular, কোনো একটা নির্দিষ্ট জিনিসের প্রতি একটা অদ্ভুত ধরনের অবসেশন, তাকে বলা হয় ফেটিশ। অ্যান্ড ফোবিয়া, certain kind of fear. এই দুটোর থ্রু দিয়ে নেটিভ সাবজেক্টের সাবজেক্টিভিটির কনস্ট্রাকশন ভাবা করার চেষ্টা করেছেন থ্রু দ্য লেন্স অফ দ্য কলোনাইজার। And he said that this form of the fetish and the phobia results in two stereotypes. And they are first, the inscrutable native, suggesting an unknowable, radically different other. A native, one kind of native culture which is almost unknowable and enigmatic, almost a radically different other, যেটাকে জানার বারবার চেষ্টা করছে ব্রিটিশ সাহেবরা কিন্তু জানতে পারছে না। Another is the vulnerable, innocent and childlike native, suggesting a knowable, controllable subject of colonial power. So for example, if we talk about British colonialism, various forms of Buddhist culture or various forms of tantric culture, various kind of black magics and necromancy in the Indian culture that were prevalent on that time, known as the Tantric. এই ধরনের কালচার নিয়ে, ফর এক্সাম্পল ব্রজযান বুদ্ধিজম, হুইচ ইজ আ তান্ত্রিক বুদ্ধিজম, তাই নিয়ে প্রচুর ইন্ডোলজিস্ট অ্যান্ড ওরিয়েন্টালিস্ট সাহেবের ভয়ঙ্কর ইন্টারেস্ট ছিল এই ধরনের সাবজেক্টের উপরে। সো এই যে পার্টিকুলার একটা সাবজেক্টের প্রতি গভীর ইন্টারেস্ট, জানার চেষ্টা করছি, ধরার চেষ্টা করছি, সেটাকে আমরা বলতে পারি দ্য ইনস্ক্রুটেবল অর আননোয়েবল অর আনট্রডেন সাইড অফ দ্য ইন্ডিজিনাস কালচার্স। While on the other hand, the thousands indigenous natives whom the colonial sahibs exploited, this can be termed as the vulnerable, innocent and childlike side of the natives. So Bhabha thus proposes a divided colonial discourse and a native subject whose subject position is never stable or automatic, just as the colonial master's position is never stable or automatic. Hence Bhabha said that both the subject position of the colonizer and the colonized is utterly unstable and it is destabilized. The subject position is never stable and automatic. both the colonizer and the colonized. So the repetition of the stereotypes is not for Bhabha a sign of the power of the colonial discourse. Rather, he treats this repetition as a sign of its inherent instability. So Bhabha says that the subject position of both the native and the sahibs are essentially unstable in nature. And stereotypes are invoked and repeated not because they are stable, but because, unless repeated, they lose their power and validity as signs. Very important words uttered by Pramod K. Nair in his book Contemporary Literary and Cultural Theory, from Structuralism to Post-Structuralism. So in this particular segment, he talked about sign. What is a sign system? Sign system can be divided into one signifier, another signifier. So the basis of language is its sign system, or the mechanism of the signs. Language as a system of communication actually basically stands on this system of signs. And Bhabha says that sign is iterated and reiterated and repeated because you have to establish your message through these signs. And hence, various forms of stereotypes in the colonial discourse has been constructed in order to establish them properly, because they are essentially unstable. So, what Bhabha meant by this form of stereotypes? Stereotype bolte Bhabha ki bujhiyeche? For example, that the Indians are essentially snake charmers. Sob shomoy shapeder banshi bajaye. Indians are essentially uncivilized, they are brute. They worship the pagan and the heathen gods. Ma Monasha থেকে শিব ঠাকুর এক গাদা ভগবান, এইভাবেই নেটিভরা বিভিন্ন ধরনের ঈশ্বরকে পুজো করে। এই যে এক ধরনের স্টিরিওটিপিক্যাল নোশন অফ দ্য নেটিভস, দ্যাট দ্য নেটিভস আর গুড সার্ভেন্টস, চাকর হিসেবে খুবই ভালো নেটিভরা, যে এই যে বিভিন্ন ধরনের কনস্ট্রাকশন অফ দ্য স্টিরিওটাইপ যেটা ভাবা বলছেন কনস্ট্রাক্ট করছেন সাহেবরা ইন দেয়ার মাইন্ড, it is essential for them. Why it is essential? In order to, unless and until they are being repeated, they will lose their power and validity and science. যদি আমি বারবার না বলি এই কথাটা যে ইন্ডিয়ান মাত্রই স্নেক চার্মার, ইন্ডিয়ান মাত্রই এসেনশিয়ালি সার্ভেন্ট, ইন্ডিয়ান মাত্রই দে আর বেসিক্যালি ফ্লাইং মংস, আকাশে উড়ে বেড়ায় এরকম মঙ্ক, এইটা যদি না আমি বারবার রিপিট করতে পারি, ফ্লাইং সাধুস, এই সায়েন্স সিস্টেম যদি আমি বারবার রিপিট না করি, দে উইল লুজ দেয়ার পাওয়ার অ্যান্ড ভ্যালিডিটি। যেটা ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজের ক্ষেত্রে হয়, যদি আমি ক্যাটকে বারবার ক্যাট ক্যাট ক্যাট, ডগকে বারবার ডগ 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 না বলি, তাহলে ডগকে যদি অন্য কেউ রুমাল বলতে শুরু করে আর বিড়ালকে যদি ডগ বলতে শুরু করে, তখনই হজবরল সৃষ্টি হয়। সো এই যে ইনস্টেবিলিটি দ্যাট ইজ ইনগ্রেইনড ইনসাইড দ্য সিস্টেম অফ ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ, তার থ্রু দিয়ে the construction of the subjectivity and subject position of the colonized and the colonizer created হচ্ছে, এটার কথাই এখানে ভাবা বলছেন। So Bhabha says that this repetition of the stereotypes is an inherent sign of the instability of the colonial discourse, because stereotypes are invoked and repeated not because they are stable, but because unless repeated, they lose their power and validity as science. So, as an example of this particular structure of repetition, Bhabha, in his famous canonical essay, seminal essay, Science Taken for Wonders, the English book, he cited the concept of the English book in his essay, Science Taken for Wonders. So, what is the English book? English book is, of course, Bible. And Bhabha argues that the Bible functioned as a sign of the colonial power and authority. It's a religious book, but at the same time, it suggests the ideological fountainhead of the English theology, the Christianity itself. The authority to disseminate the book throughout the colony. You have to disseminate the book throughout the colony through various evangelical missions. But however, Bhabha notes that the sign, that is the book, is riddled with ambivalence in the very act of disseminating it. How? Bhabha suggests that the book is translated by natives into their own contexts. A process that is replete with subversion as well as some form of resistance, because translation means actually subversion. The very act of translation actually means subversion and resistance, and hence the Bible, when it is translated into the context the native context, it can be interpreted in multifarious ways. In the same way, Ramayana, for example, the text which has been generally treated as a primary epic by the Indians, in it the character of the Rama has completely been subverted in the imagination of Krittibash. In the imagination of Krittibash, Ram is not a very powerful masculine North Indian figure, but rather he is a Bengali husband who is garrulous and dependent on his wife, who is a cuckold rather, and argues with his wife. So এই যে রামচন্দ্র, উত্তর ভারতীয় রামচন্দ্র, যেটা বাল্মীকির রামায়ণের একটা খুবই ম্যাস্কুলাইন ক্যারেক্টার, সেই রাম কিন্তু আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি কৃত্তিবাসী রামায়ণে এই ভাত খাওয়া ভুঁড়িওয়ালা একটা বাঙালি রামে পরিণত হয়েছে, যে বউয়ের কথায় হয়তো ভয় টয় পায়। এবার প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে যে ট্রান্সলেশন কিন্তু is not always an authentic experience. Translation always involves these forms of subversion and sometimes resistance, and hence Bhabha here speaks of repetition with a difference, an idea seen in the deconstructive criticism, for example, in J. Hillis Miller's studies of the English novel in fiction and repetition. যেখানে deconstructive ওয়েতে কোনটা particular টেক্সটকে পড়া হচ্ছে। I have told you what deconstruction is. Deconstruction is a different method of reading a particular text, undermining its metaphysics of presence. That is deconstruction. So translation is essentially a deconstructive process, and when it is subject to the Bible, the English book, the so-called ideological fountainhead of the Christian theology, when it is being translated by the natives, it is subjected to various forms of resistance and subversion. And hence, when the native repeats the English book, he or she does so with variations, and the book might lose its nuances, and they can add meanings which is not originally present there, and thus the book acquires a wholly different form, and by extension loses its authority as a colonial sign. As an ideological discourse maker, the book loses its ability to register as a colonial sign inside the mind of the natives. So it is now a sign that has been rewritten by the native. The native have completely rewritten the sign. অন্যরকম ভাবে বাইবেলকে সাথে লিখে ফেলেছে ট্রান্সলেশনের থ্রু দিয়ে। So বুঝতে পারছো কিভাবে the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is not essentially an unidirectional flow of power, but rather it is being subverted and inverted in various ways. So this is the inherent instability of colonial discourse, and the potential for resistance is always there. And Bhabha uses the term ambivalence to describe this rupture between the hoped for original authority of the English book or sign and the effect of the iteration, repetition and difference. So Bhabha used the term ambivalence to describe this context of the rupture. There falls the shadow, to quote Eliot's own words, between your perception of something and the execution. তুমি যেটা ভেবেছো যেটা করবে, আর যেটা করলে, কলোনাইজার যেটা ভেবেছে আর যেটা করলো, তার মধ্যে একটা বিস্তর ফারাক রয়ে গেছে। এই যে ভেরিয়াস ফর্মস অফ সাবভার্সনস অ্যান্ড রেজিস্ট্যান্স মনে করছে বাইবেলের থ্রু দিয়ে একটা কলোনিয়াল ডিসকোর্সকে এস্টাবলিশ করবো, but he fell so in establishing the colonial discourse because various forms of cultural resistance on the part of the natives. এই যে ট্রান্সলেশন ইজ এ প্রসেস অফ রেজিস্ট্যান্স, ট্রান্সলেশন যখন হচ্ছে এসেনশিয়ালি সে রেজিস্ট করছে, অন্য কালচারকে মেনে নিচ্ছে না, তার মতো করে কালচারকে কোঅপ্ট করছে, তার মতো করে কালচারকে অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট করছে। বাইবেলও তো একটা বাঙালির বাইবেলে পরিণত হয়েছে ট্রান্সলেশনের মাধ্যমে। তো এই যে অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েশন অফ দ্য ডিফারেন্ট কালচার্স অফ দ্য কলোনাইজার্স কালচার ইন আ ডিফারেন্ট ওয়ে, সেটা কি ভাবা বলছেন কি অ্যাম্বিভ্যালেন্স। Ambivalence মানে ambiguous things. Ambiguous means that which cannot be interpreted through a single word, or there exists multiple meanings. That is ambivalence. So there occurs the rupture between the hoped for original authority and the effect of iteration, difference and repetition. So ambivalence কাকে বলে বোঝা গেল আশা করছি। Now moving on from ambivalence, extending this argument about the potential resistance on the part of the native subject, Bhabha proposes the idea of the mimicry in his another famous essay of Mimicry and Man, collected in the book Nation and Narration. So what is mimicry? Mimicry is the disciplined imitation of the white man by the native. Disciplined imitation and emulation of the white man by the native. Native যখন ডিসিপ্লিন ওয়েতে হোয়াইট ম্যানকে পুরোপুরি অনুসরণ করছে তখন তাকে বলা যেতে পারে মিমিক্রি। The native has been taught consistently that he needs to try to ape the white man and his culture. And mimicry is sought through Western education, religion and structures where the native is trained to think and behave like the white man. However, Bhabha uses and Bhabha sees this as a site where colonial authority, rather than being reinforced, actually breaks down. এখানেই colonialism ভেঙে পড়ছে। কিভাবে? What happens in the colonial encounter is that the native becomes anglicized, but is never fully or truly white, because he or she will never be able to change his or her skin color or racial baggage. So he becomes a mimic man who can now insinuate himself into the colonial structure, respond in English, and adopt the structure of the logic and reasoning in argument which Western education has taught him. So this form of Western education has actually become a kind of weapon to him. His knowing of the language of the English actually becomes a weapon to him. একটা অস্ত্রতে পরিণত হলো। সে ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজটা জানলো, ওয়েস্টার্ন কালচারটাও জানলো, এটা দিয়ে সে এখন রেজিস্ট করার চেষ্টা করবে। So when Raja Ram Mohan Roy argues in favor of the English education in his letter to Lord Amherst, he appropriates a rational argument rather than a sentimental one. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy যখন লর্ড অ্যামহার্স্টকে চিঠি লিখছেন সতীদাহ প্রথা বন্ধ করে দেওয়ার জন্য বা যে কোনো ধরনের রিফরমেশনের কথা তিনি তার লেটারের মধ্যে বলছে, he is appropriating a rational argument because he has learned this so-called logical and rational argument from the Western education. So he is not appealing in a very sentimental tone. যেটা নেটিভকে ভাবা হয় সেরকমভাবে কিন্তু মানে নেটিভকে যেরকমভাবে দেখা হয়, কলোনাইজার যেভাবে দেখে সেরকমভাবে কিন্তু রামমোহন রায় উত্তর দিচ্ছেন না। একজন একটা প্রপার লজিক্যাল আর্গুমেন্টেটিভ ওয়েতে উনি আর্গুমেন্ট করছেন। হি অ্যাপিলস টু দ্য ইংলিশ ইন দ্য ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ অফ দ্য লজিক, রিজন অ্যান্ড অ্যাডমিনিস্ট্রেটিভ কনভেনিয়েন্স অ্যান্ড এক্সপিডিয়েন্সি that they would recognize rather than the sentimental pleas which would have been rejected for being truly native. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy or for example Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, a man who answered the Britishers, the colonial power, truly in the language of the Britishers. Britishers যে ভাষায় বোঝে, যেভাবে তাদের মিলিটারি স্ট্র্যাটেজি তারা সাজায়, সেরকমভাবেই সুভাষচন্দ্র বোস তার লজিক সাজিয়েছেন, তার মিলিটারি স্ট্র্যাটেজি তিনি সাজিয়েছেন, সাহায্য নিয়েছেন আদার ইম্পর্টেন্ট কলোনিয়াল পাওয়ার্স লাইক দ্য নাৎসিস and the Italian and the German powers. It can be, of course, criticized in a virulent manner, of course. এর বিভিন্ন ধরনের criticism অবশ্যই possible, কিন্তু he is answering in the language of the Britishers. So the mimic man here appears to follow the white man's authority, to show the power of the colonial discourse, but in effect fractures and disrupts it. So mimicry here reveals the breaks in the colonial discourse. The native represents him or herself rather than being represented. So native, a powerful native who is a mimic man, represents himself. As Bhabha puts it, the meanness of mimicry is its double vision, which in disclosing the ambivalence of the colonial discourse also disrupts its authority. So mimicry becomes a menacing force to the colonizer because it creates a kind of double vision, and it completely dislocates the colonial discourse, the power of the colonial discourse, by creating a form of ambivalence, by disrupting its authority. So Bhabha's work, to put in one word, Bhabha's work reveals that the colonial discourse is unstable and fractured, is ambivalent, and of course is open to various forms of subversions that I've already mentioned. And each time colonialism seeks to impose its authority through a repetition of the sign, the emblem, be it any form of token, the Bible, anything, the natives' repetition of the sign through translation or other things dismantles it by adding or subtracting any intended or original meaning depending on his need. So the native often disrupts the entire meaning-making system of the European Sahib, and always tries to subvert and resist the colonial discourse. So that is Bhabha's main notion of mimicry and ambivalence. So let us now summarize what is mimicry. Mimicry sometimes also fails because the colonial master, on the one hand, wants the native as similar to himself as possible, and on the other wishes to keep the difference between himself and the native. That is, the colonial power wishes to both erase and reinforce the difference, the ambivalence as noted in the colonial discourse before. So the colonial power always tries to erase this sense of the ambivalence. Even as the colonial master works this ambivalent state, the native begins to repeat or mime the master, but with subtle variations and nuances. The mimicry of the native often encodes a facile obedience and obsequiousness, a deeper disobedience and mockery, what Bhabha in his essay of the same titles this as sly civility. So this dual state of the mimicry by the native, one that is the direct result of the fractured nature of the colonial discourse, is what Bhabha terms hybridity. So mimicry, the dual state of the mimicry of the native, the essential fractured self of the native create korche in the colonial discourse, etake Bhabha bolechen hybridity. So what is hybridity? Hybrid mane that which combines two or more than two origin points. যে কনসেপশনটার মধ্যে তিন বা চারটে আইডিয়া থাকে, তিন বা চারটে মিক্সিং অফ দ্য ভেরিয়াস এলিমেন্টস থাকে, তাকে হাইব্রিড বলা হয়। হাইব্রিড পটল, হাইব্রিড ঝিঙে। সো হাইব্রিডিটি ইজ আ ক্রিয়েশন অফ নিউ transcultural forms within the contact zone produced by the colonization. So what is contact zone? Contact zone is the zone where the colonized and the colonizer, they interact with one another. That is called contact zone. So in this contact zone, new transcultural forms, new forms of cultures have been produced because of this process of colonization. So the term refers to the cross-breeding of the two separate species by grafting to form a third hybrid species. So hybridity is the journey from the biological to the cultural discussions. It's a biological term. It has been transformed into a cultural term by Homi K Bhabha. It is the mixture of the two cultures, races or religions. It can be linguistic, cultural, political, racial, social and religious. It can be mixing of the two different cultures, two different political ideologies, two different social standpoint, two different religious ideologies. Age at a male or female face, suggesting a confluence of various forms of culture. Here we can see the African Zulu culture. Here we can see perhaps the traces of the Mayan civilization, and here we can see perhaps the fractured identity of the West. এই সব কিছুর যে একসঙ্গে একটা unified form, unified but at the same time has a transcultural confluence of many cultures. It is called hybridity. So it is not always necessarily a peaceful mixture. So this Bhabha's concept of the hybridity also alludes to the Derridian conception of bricolage. Derrida talks about different signifiers and signifieds, different concepts creating a new concept, different linguistic terminologies creating a new notion. It's called bricolage. Hybridity is almost like the bricolage on the level of the colonial discourse, on the level of the transcultural form. So this is perhaps an example of the mimicry, where we can see different forms of culture, African culture, westernized culture, different forms of costumes. The costume with the skin of the cheetah, which essentially signifies the African culture. At the same time, you can see the westernized culture, bikini, and representation of the other African tribes through various other costumes. So this is almost a mimicry, an example of mimicry. So let us quote from Bhabha's of Mimicry and Man. Bhabha said, the discourse of mimicry is constructed around an ambivalence. In order to be effective, mimicry must continually produce its slippage, its excess, its difference. Mimicry is thus the sign of a double articulation, a complex strategy of reform, regulation and discipline, which appropriates the other as it visualizes power. So mimicry is thus the sign of a double articulation. It's a very complex strategy of reform and regulation and discipline, which appropriates the other as it visualizes power. So mimicry appropriates the other. Mimicry is also the sign of the inappropriate, and however a difference of recalcitrance which coheres the dominant strategic function of colonial power, intensifies surveillance and poses an immanent threat to both normalized knowledges and disciplinary power. So this form of mimicry always questions normalized form of knowledges and disciplinary forms of power. Bhabha also coined other two terminologies. One is in-betweenness and another is third space. So according to Bhabha, the hybridized native who refuses to return the colonial gaze and who refuses to acknowledge the colonizer's position and authority is placed in a position of the in-betweenness. So a hybridized native who refuses to return the colonial gaze, যে essentially colonizer কোনো উত্তর দিতে চায় না, colonial gaze দিয়ে কোনো answer দেয় না, but at the same time also refuses to acknowledge the colonizer's position and authority. তাকে উত্তর দেবে না, রেজিস্টার করবে না, আবার essentially তাকে তার ইনফ্লুয়েন্স অ্যাকনলেজও করবে না। এই মাঝামাঝি জায়গায় যে নেটিভরা থাকে, যে ইন্ডিজিনাস পিপলরা থাকে, সেই পার্টিকুলার পজিশনটাকে বাবা ব্যাখ্যা করতে গিয়ে বলেছেন ইন বিটুইননেস। So between adopted Englishness and the original Indianness. So mimicry that results in this dualism of deference and disobedience is what Bhabha sees as a form of resistance. Mimicry that results in this dualism of deference, defer korche, Derrida's moto postpone korche, karon answer dicche na immediately, and not even willing to go back to his or her original position, then it is called in-betweenness. So this is the site where a colonial identity. So this form of mimicry and hybridity actually creates a third space. What is third space? Third space is a site where the colonial identity and native identity meet and often contest. This is a space where the identity of the colonizer and the colonized, they meet and they often contest. It's a space of conflict. B, colonial discourse is both and at once asserted and subverted in this particular space. In this particular space, colonial discourse is being asserted, at the same time has been resisted and subverted. So there is always C, deference and difference in the colonial discourse, as Derrida calls it, because colonial discourse is not a monolithic structure, and hence it can be postponed and at the same time it can be deferred. So D, there is a split and a negotiation inside the colonialist discourse, and the mimicry and the mockery occurs in this particular space of negotiation, splitting, deference and difference. So this particular thing has been called by Bhabha as the third space. So third space is the subject, where the native subject begins to articulate resistance. The subject for Bhabha is thus the split, decentered, unstable and resistant one. So this is Homi K Bhabha, and I have explained you Bhabha's theory of the mimicry, hybridity, third space and in-betweenness. So to sum up, Bhabha was an Indian English scholar and critical theorist. His writings are extremely obscure and very difficult in nature. If you read the original texts of Homi Bhabha, two of the most famous books of Homi Bhabha are Nation and Narration, and one is Nation and Narration, and I forgot the name of the other book. I'm sorry, I'll inform you later. So Bhabha in his theory of post-colonialism sees post-colonial identity not as a stable and fixed identity, and he shows that the colonial discourse is also not a stable and unidirectional flow of power. A discourse not based on unidirectional flow of power. Often it is not a monolithic structure, often it is it failed, and hence therefrom produces these notions of the ambivalence, hybridity and mimicry. So I have explained these things in my lecture. Thank you so much. In the next lecture I'll talk about Gayatri Chakraborty Sriva, his notions of the of subaltern and her essay Can the Subaltern Speak, and of course I'll discuss her standpoint regarding post-colonial feminism. I'll end the lecture in the next class by discussing Dipesh Chakraborty's Provincializing Europe, Parthu Chatterjee's writings and Gayatri Srivak's writing. So thank you so much. We'll see you in the next lecture.